Hello and welcome to the Journal Writing Workshop. I'm Kevin Parton, and through this series of PowerPoints, I lead us through the workshop. I'll be emphasizing various aspects about what it is to be writing a journal article, and I'll emphasize what's a good way to write a journal article. At the outset, let me acknowledge the rest of the team in this workshop: Mark Morrison, Oliver Burmeister and Joan Quinn. Mark and I have been working on this kind of material for about the last decade. Oliver joined us a few years ago, and Joan is a new arrival. Now, there'll be a series of 6 sessions in the workshop. This is session 1. In this session, we'll be looking at what's termed concept planning. So the session will start with introductions, but the main and crucial component of this session is what's termed concept planning. Just a few initial comments. Everyone acknowledges that writing papers is difficult. Even very successful authors who publish regularly in international journals, even for those authors, they would acknowledge that writing is difficult. The writing of your paper will require total commitment. It won't just be committing the odd 15 minutes here and there. You'll have to commit blocks of time. It takes several hours before you can achieve useful writing progress. You'll have to commit blocks of time over a period of time. Now, what we are targeting here is over the next few days, you'll be given a few tools and techniques. Then over the next few weeks, you'll need to write some really good journal articles. Over that period, you'll have to commit several mornings, several afternoons that will get the writing to the required level of proficiency. And you'll have to be totally committed to that process. Having emphasized that writing is difficult, there is nevertheless help at hand. That's the purpose of this workshop. It is to provide you with some examples of things that you can do that the masters of our trade have discovered. That is, those who write papers regularly, they've discovered this. They've discovered various ways forward that allow writing to be done in an efficient manner and with the minimum of elapsed time. And when they do that, they still turn out a high quality product. That's what we're about in this workshop, producing high quality papers with the minimum of elapsed time. Now, if we were in a face-to-face workshop, we would spend some time now in introductions, who you are, where you're from, and so on. We'd also be networking. Now, hopefully, we'll still manage some networking, even in this online mode. But at this point, I'll just skip over this section on introductions. Writing, we note, is a process, and it is a process that moves forward in a cycle. The first step is that I shall describe some principles or processes. You'll then go away and write something. That is, you'll do some work. You'll be writing a draft. That's the work. Next, third step, there is some review. It could be self-review or it could be somebody else's review. The next step, the fourth step, is that we then write a revision based on that review. And then finally, it comes back round again. I'll describe some other process or principle, and then we'll go round the loop again. So that's the cyclical process that we'll be going through in this workshop. Now, that cyclical process is the process of work that we'll be engaged in. It's work, review, revision, and principles. And we'll have 4 reviews probably in total, so that as well as writing your paper, you may be called on to be a reviewer. You may be called on to review somebody else's paper. It's important that in all those reviews, we do straightforward reviews that are straight to the point, that are critical and are honest. So every review should be straight to the point, critical and honest. Throughout the workshop, we need to apply some principles. And there are these 3 principles that I think we should apply. We need to be respectful, critical, and supportive of each other. The idea of the workshop is for us to move forward together as a community group. So what's the starting point? Well, the starting point for writing is really a blank page. We ask you to bring your results of any analysis that you've done. They could be written in front of you in text. But apart from that, there's a blank page. Nothing is meant to have been written as far as the paper's concerned. So we first of all write a concept plan. We do not start to write the paper. And that's what this first session is all about. Not until we get to the second of these sessions will we talk about writing the paper. In this session, it's just the concept plan. As I've said, we start with a blank page. Reason is that minimizes the number of writing iterations. That is, the number of drafts you will have to write will be minimized as long as you start with a concept plan. So we've got a particular journal in mind, perhaps. We can think of one. We'll talk more about selecting journals later on, but it's a good idea to start with some vague idea of a paper in mind, with a journal rather in mind. Let's have a journal in mind. Second, note that it's bad practice to try to edit a report into a journal article. It takes a long time to do that, and you never quite get the quality that you could have achieved if you'd started with a blank sheet approach. On the other hand, it's good practice to come to the point of writing your paper with the analysis done, and indeed with the results written in text in front of you. Maybe these results could be in the form of a report. That's okay. But most of the report is nevertheless going to be thrown away in this journal writing process. So now let's come to conceptual planning, or writing a concept plan. By concept, what do I mean? It's an idea, a notion, thought, perception, impression, theory, model, hypothesis, view, or a belief. That's the idea behind the paper. It's the concept behind the paper. That's what a concept is. A concept is therefore the big idea. The big idea behind our paper is the current context of this workshop. First thing to note about the big idea or the concept is that it can be small or large in terms of subject matter and location. Here are some examples of small. A new method of reducing cabbage moth damage. Another example of small. Settlement patterns in the Lachlan and what they mean for rural infrastructure investment. But nevertheless, the big ideas can be big. Here's one. how climate change is likely to impact on world trade for rice. The scope of this is bigger. It is worth emphasizing, though, that each of those big ideas, be they small or large, each of them is going to produce a paper of similar length. The final published journal article will be of the same length approximately. That means that this kind of workshop that we're engaged in applies to all these types of papers. Okay, let's get on to the concept plan. Let's define it. It's a map of the territory of your paper that remains largely unaltered during the course of writing the paper. Purpose: to keep your mind focused on the big idea behind what you are writing about. It's usually best to have one contribution per paper and to avoid writing a paper with many minor contributions. Therefore, in this process of writing a concept plan, we identify first of all the contribution of the paper. And if there's other material that's not assisting the contribution of the paper, then that goes somewhere else. For example, into another paper. I'd also add that multiple part papers are complex. Not only that, but some journals don't want to publish those. And it's a good idea to consult with the editor before committing to a strategy of writing a multi-part paper. Okay, let's go on and look at an example of this concept planning. Our big idea started like this. Climate change has various effects on supply of rice in Thailand. That is, with climate change, there'll be more droughts and floods. Thailand is an important producer of rice. It exports rice in a big way to the international market. So, climate change has various effects on supply of rice in Thailand. This is likely to have an impact on international markets for rice. Can we find out what its impact is? That was our starting point. Step 2. Can we apply supply chain analysis to assess how instability in rice production is transmitted to the international market? That is, we've discovered and decided on a method, supply chain analysis, to assess and analyze that problem. So here we are with the 5 components of a concept plan. There's previous work, the need, what I did, research closure, and conclusions. Once you've got those 5 things written down, you've got a concept plan. So what's previous work? It's just a brief summary of where the literature is. Then, having summarized the literature, you should be able to explain what the gap in the literature is, that is, the need. Then you can describe what we did to address the issue, that is, what was our analysis. Step 4, research closure, or what we found. Now, research closure can be speculative or it can be research. If you're writing about theory, it's generally speculative. And we're saying to the profession or the literature, go and test what I say. If we're doing more applied research, the research takes it a step further towards closure. It says, this is where things work. And most papers, in fact, are research closure. Step 5, we write our conclusions, and the conclusions are largely instructions for our peers. That is, people who are also writing journal articles. We write instructions for the research community about what we found and, more importantly, what it means. We should emphasize we're interested in conclusions, and in the conclusions we say what it means. For example, this research shows that policy intervention X works in circumstance Y. Okay, let's go through an example. And it's the Thai rice example. Previous work, there's been much work on the likely impact of climate change on production in many countries, including rice production in Thailand. That part of it's done. The impact of climate change on production of rice in Thailand is largely done. We now come to the need. It has simply been presumed that supply effects get transmitted to the international market. Our view was that there was a need to analyze this more closely. That is, do supply effects in northeastern Thailand, do they simply get transmitted? Does that variation in supply simply get transmitted directly in a 1-to-1 ratio to the international market? 3. What we did. We did survey work to establish some things about the configuration of rice supply chains in Thailand. That is, how participants along the supply chain behave. We figured it out. This is how they behave under different circumstances. We then did some modeling work to analyze how it was that unstable supply at one end of the chain moves through the supply chain from producers to the international market. How does production move through the supply chain? We then had research closure, which was using a stochastic simulation model. We developed this model from northeast Thailand, which was the rice growing area. Then the results indicate that droughts periodically cause large production losses that flow on to significant supply chain problems such as fluctuating inventory levels, stockouts, and unfilled customer demand. In fact, our analysis discovered that there's more instability in international markets than that experienced in production. Next, conclusions. These are, in fact, preliminary results because we only looked at drought. Under climate change, flooding is also expected to be a problem. Also, the modeling of different types of supply chain configuration could be a useful thing. That is, can we alter the supply chain, maybe through policy in some way, to overcome the instability that seems to be transmitted along that chain? That was one of our concluding suggestions. And the result was this paper. Here's another big idea. Let's look at another example. What is the best way to discover the attitudes of the Australian public towards climate change? It's a big idea. I'll do it quickly. You can refer back to the video at any future time if you need to. So I'll just work through this quickly. Okay, previous work. Well, there was work in the US by Maybach and colleagues, and it was about segmenting the American population. They segmented the American population into 6 separate groups based on their attitude towards global warming. Can we do the same in Australia? So there's the description of need. We wanted to identify distinct groups in Australia in order to focus public campaigns on particular groups. Next, what we did. We did a survey which replicated the American survey. We did a survey for the Australian public. Research closure. We showed that there were a similar 6 segments in Australia to the US, but the membership numbers in the segments were very different for Australia, and that needed to be taken into our account in our analysis. So if you want to analyze climate change policy in Australia, although the groups of people are similar, the proportions in each group are different, and it's important to take that into effect if you want to analyze climate change policy. There's a series of conclusions which end with, we recommend that audience segmentation efforts that rely on a particular type of analysis should be done for their own country. That is, each country needs to do a separate analysis. You can't just depend on the results you've seen elsewhere. And this is the paper that resulted from that work. Okay, let's go on now and make some summary points. A concept plan then is a map of your territory, the territory of your writing. It keeps you on track as you continue to write your paper. A good test of whether you've got a reasonable concept plan is this. Can you describe orally what you've been writing to another person in no more than 2 minutes? If you can do that, then probably you've got a reasonable concept plan. So in other words, once you've written your concept plan, fold it up, put it aside, and now go and have a discussion over coffee with somebody else. There, your task will be to describe in less than 2 minutes what you're writing about in the paper. If you can do that, things are going quite well. Notice some things that I am emphasizing at this point. A concept plan is not a skeleton of the eventual paper. Importantly, as I said earlier, as you write your paper, a concept plan is a map to keep your mind focused on the chief reason for your paper. So it's now over to you to write your concept plan. That concept plan will have these 5 components, so that in this table you will need to fill out the 5 entries in the column on the right-hand side of the table. That brings us to the end of this first session of the workshop.